Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Recovery Support Services Echo, brought to you by the Center for Substance Use Training and Telementoring, also known as CSTAT, by Be Well Texas, in collaboration with the UT Health San Antonio Echo program. My name is Angela Riley. My pronouns are she, her, and I will be the facilitator for today's session. A few housekeeping items before we begin. To help us with attendance, please enter your full name, affiliation, and email into the chat. Please remember to stay muted unless you are speaking. We encourage using the chat and/or the raise your hand feature to pose questions or share perspectives throughout the session. If possible, we also encourage everyone to join us by video. If you are having connection issues, please privately chat Cato, our Echo IT, for assistance. And as a note, these sessions are being recorded and will be shared on the Be Well Texas YouTube channel. Therefore, to ensure privacy, no personal health information is allowed at any point during the session. This includes names, addresses, birthdays, or any other identifiable information. At the end of the session, Cato will be sending out a link to an evaluation of the session. We kindly ask that you please fill this out as it gives us feedback. All participants filling out the survey or the evaluation will be automatically entered into a raffle for a $30 Walmart gift card. And finally, Echo is an all teach, all learn environment, and we do encourage everyone to participate in the conversation and raise questions, whether it be by unmuting or in the chat. And let us always make every effort to avoid bias and stigmatizing terms so that we can continue having a space that is respectful and safe to learn. With that, we'll move on to team introductions. I'll start with Richard Hamner. If you could unmute and introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Glad you're here. Richard Hamner. I'm with Be Well Texas, the Recovery Support Services Program Manager and Hub member. So glad to see everyone.
Thanks, Richard. Susie Walker.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Susie Walker, and I am on the Hub team, and I'm with Faces and Voices of Recovery. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. Our newest team member, Dr. Hernandez.
Good afternoon, good people. Janet Hernandez. I am a person in long-term recovery. Happy to be here with you. Looking forward to learn from you and participating in this session. Thank you.
Thank you for being here and for being part of our team. Our case presenter for today, Belinda Honey.
Hi, I'm Belinda Honey. I'm a person in long-term recovery, and I am with Christian Farms Treehouse in Temple, Texas. I'm a recovery support peer specialist and a peer specialist supervisor.
Wonderful. Thank you for being here and for being our case presenter. And finally, our didactic presenter for today, Dr. Cynthia Phelps.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be here. I'm in long-term recovery from alcohol use, and I own a company where I help people get the inside of themselves right. And so I'm delighted to be here today to talk about grief and burnout.
Thank you, Dr. Phelps. Thank you for being here. And thank you all. And if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat by entering your full name, affiliation, and email. So with that, we'll get started with our didactic presentation. Dr. Phelps, you may take it away.
All right, let's do it. All right, you see those slides just fine, everybody?
Yes, that looks good.
Thank you. All right. Well, today, oh, this looks like the last slide. Let's go really fast. There we go. Let's start.
There we go.
Well, today I'm going to be talking about how to navigate grief while you're working with people in recovery and how grief intersects with burnout. And so here's our disclosure slide. I don't know if you need me to read that, or we just need to acknowledge it. And here's our learning objectives for today. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what grief is. I will present some types of grief, And we're going to dispel some common misconceptions about grief. We're going to recognize how grief might express in ourselves and other people. And I have some tools that I would love to share with you, mindfulness and compassion-based tools to help you mitigate grief and soothe some of the difficult emotions that come with it. So let's get started. Grief is something that we're not often talking about in our culture. It has a fair amount of stigma around it, but as people who work in the world of recovery, we're used to working with those types of things, right? And so the basic definition of grief is that it is a normal response to a loss. Now, oftentimes we think about the loss as being someone passing away. But it can be any kind of loss, really. It can be a loss of a job. It could be a loss of something that's important to you, something that you love or hold dear. And so it's really more general than just working with the death of another person. Grief is sometimes called an emotion, but really it's a complex set of emotions that can sometimes even be contradictory and show up differently in different people. Grief affects us physically, emotionally, behaviorally, cognitively, and spiritually. And we're going to dig in a little bit deeper to all of that. All right. Is this, hold on a second. I'm having trouble navigating my slides here. Just one moment. Okay. One of the things I wanted to do is talk about the myths of grief, because there's a lot of misconceptions about what it is and how it works. And so one of the main myths is that there's just one way to grieve and we all kind of go through the same experience. And in fact, that's actually the opposite of the truth, in that every person that goes through grief actually has their own experience. Another misconception is that it has a timeline, like that it has to only last for so long, when in fact, grief is something that really is on its own schedule. We're kind of along for the ride to a certain extent with the process of grief. Grief, we often think in our Western mentality here that every day is going to get better, and our healing process is going to be like this straightforward pathway. But in fact, grief can really wax and wane, and it can do that for a long period of time. And one of the ways that a dear mentor described grief for me that I thought was so useful is with this hand motion, where sometimes in the beginning, when we first have the loss, grief feels like it's covering us. It feels like it's the only thing that we can see. But as we move away and do a little bit of healing, it kind of comes out here. But then sure enough, it'll come back around. But then as time goes by and we do some more healing, it begins to cycle a little bit further away from us. And then eventually it'll be cycling out here. We're never going to forget that loss, right? It's always going to be there, but it's not affecting your day-to-day life. And so I thought that was a really good metaphor for kind of how grief goes through, how we go through the grief process. And grief can be called an emotion, but really the process of grief is a complex set of emotions. There is an entry in the DSM-5 for prolonged grief disorder, but more and more folks are recognizing this idea that because when you're in grief, it's not something that needs to be pathologized. It's not something that has to be fixed. It may be uncomfortable. You may want to relieve yourself of some of that suffering, but we're really in this time of shifting to view grief in a different way. And in fact, when I work with people who are experiencing grief, one of the things that I like to remind them that the only reason you're experiencing grief is because you've lost something or someone that you love. And grief, as the response, is almost an honoring of that person or thing that you lost. And so that's a very different way of thinking about it than how we thought about it in the past. All right, I'm going to get this. Is there a slide thing down yet? You wouldn't know that I have a experience in technology. So you might be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. This is taught in like every intro to psychology course. One of the things you may not know that this model of stages of grief was developed for someone who was dying. So she described some of the things that a person who was getting ready to die was going through. And the classic denial, anger, depression, bargaining, and then acceptance are the 5 stages that she defined. But people thought this was a really great way to conceptualize grief. And it was really kind of the first time that anybody had broken down grief into its component parts to be able to better understand it. So it was really revolutionary. At the same time, the way we understand grief is different now because we don't see grief as this progressive staged thing that we go through. It looks a little bit like the diagram on the right, a little bit like spaghetti. And so if you are experiencing grief or one of your clients is experiencing grief, because there's so much loss in the world of recovery and addiction, you can remind them that, sometimes days are going to be hard. Sometimes you're going to loop back into the anger or loop back into the depression, even if you have come a long ways from where you were before. Okay, types of grief. I wanted to put this slide in here, not because I want you to memorize the different types of grief, but I wanted to put it in here to showcase the variety. And so stigmatized grief, this is when you lose something or someone and it has a stigma associated with it. So losses related to addiction, suicide, HIV, LGBTQ, um, infidelity, these types of things can be stigmatized. And so you might actually be experiencing shame or blame from the outside if you're going through this type of grief. Disenfranchised grief is similar to stigmatized grief, but this is when you have the loss, but you're not able to express it openly or publicly because it's not acceptable. And so that can be a very painful type of grief, and it's very common in addiction. Um, I think it was almost a year after I told anyone in my life that I went into recovery. Because I had some serious disenfranchised grief, but lucky for me, I'm still at it. Ambiguous grief is when you are grieving something. It's not totally lost, but in function, it's lost for you. And so military deployment, divorce, where maybe you still have kids together and you see each other occasionally. Estrangement is a big one for folks in recovery because there are some people that we no longer can have in our lives, and we may love these people. And so ambiguous grief is something you could talk about with your client, that pain of that separation is real. Vicarious grief is when you experience the symptoms of grief by listening to someone else's loss. And if you had a chance to listen to the talk that I gave last year here at ECHO, I talked about vicarious trauma, which is our ability to be traumatized by other people's trauma. And so this is kind of along the same lines. And so if you are in a position working with a client where you feel like you are taking on some of those grief symptoms, know that this is a real thing that happens and that you can give yourself permission to take care of yourself and to, talk about it and to work with that grief yourself. Collective grief is something I'm very well acquainted with right now. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, and we just went through a ridiculous hurricane. And I have experienced a lot of the symptoms of grief, the cognitive symptoms of grief for sure. Compounded grief is the word that they use for basically when you have multiple losses in a row. And this is often where people need to seek more support and help because grief tends to really build on itself and it can become unmanageable when you have too many things that happen to you in a row. And to be honest with you, that's what led me to um, abusing alcohol. So let's, did I miss a slide? I'm always, yeah, there we go. Physical symptoms of grief. I'm not going to read them all out, but it doesn't feel good. The emotional symptoms, this is just a small list of some of the things that you might experience. The cognitive symptoms were something I wasn't quite as aware of. And so the inability to concentrate, memory problems, some confusion, I have had some of those things as a result of the hurricane and being displaced from my home and so forth. And so it's important that we recognize that cognitive symptoms exist with grief because we might attribute them to something else and we might see it as a personal failing. And so I think it's important to talk about those cognitive symptoms. And then behavioral symptoms like impaired work performance, crying. I'm not a person that considers crying a symptom. I think crying, I really kind of encourage people to express their emotions. But other things like withdrawal or overreactivity, isolation can be challenging for folks. And so, geez Louise, overlapping symptoms between grief and burnout. Here is a whole bunch of them. And I thought this was really interesting because I just experienced this. And I teach some workshops on grief, and I have a dear mentor that I've studied with who is a grief expert. And I still needed to walk myself through the grief of the loss of what was going on here in my city and also like within myself. And so just taking a peek at these burnout symptoms, I want you to be able to remember some of these when some loss happens to you at work or in your life, that some of these things can happen to you at work. And it's real, it's not imagined. And so classic burnout symptoms, so much overlap with grief. And because we work in recovery, there are so many people experiencing grief. Now, your clients may not use that word with you, right? They may just come in and they may be showing some of the symptoms of grief. And so you can be looking for some of the symptoms of grief, looking for some of, or maybe even asking some exploratory questions with your clients about loss. Because often when we're in recovery, especially early recovery, like we're just holding it together, like we don't really want to necessarily explore the grief of losing a job or losing a relationship as a result of that. But it's really part of our healing process, and it can really help you to understand ways in which your clients are behaving. That might be a direct result of experiencing grief. And as we talked about with vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, we can almost experience this secondary grief when we're listening to the stories of our clients and the losses that they've incurred in their journeys to get to recovery. And even in the recovery process, none of us are immune from the tragedies that come with being human and being alive. And so keep an eye on yourself for symptoms of burnout. This is when you feel basically exhausted, mentally exhausted, emotionally exhausted. I probably don't need to describe to anybody what burnout feels like. Probably well acquainted. Um, uh, and I think when it says that it's brought on by prolonged and repeated stress, grief can be one of the things that counts as a stressor for sure. That's really a big one. So, all right, we got 10 minutes. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about what do we do? So we know grief is difficult. It's full of a big bucket of challenging emotions, and we don't really know what the timeline's going to be. So there's also quite a bit of uncertainty that goes along with it. And so I wanted to include in this presentation some tools so that you can begin to help yourself, and then also teach some of these tools to others around you, your clients, your coworkers, anyone that'll listen. Okay, so this might be a strange slide for me to transition to. Oftentimes, when we think about ritual, we think about maybe we think about religion, or maybe we think about like a witch with her pot, creating some kind of ritual or some kind of magic. But in fact, rituals are really powerful, and the core definition is a gesture done with intention by an individual or community for the purposes of healing and transformation. Now that sounds real yummy to me. And rituals transcend all kinds of cultures, religions, communities. They transcend time. Humans have been doing rituals since the beginning of time. They're deeply human. And one of the things that is really important about a ritual is that it's an embodied practice. So a lot of mindfulness or compassion-based activities that you might do to soothe grief or to work through, process some of the emotions of grief, they happen kind of on the inside of you. They happen cognitively, they happen emotionally, where ritual is like a thing you do. You take your body and you go to the funeral, or you create a ritual. It can be something as simple as lighting a candle. It can be some kind of way that you attach meaning to doing something physically with your body. And ritual is really important because it's one of the ways that humans have healed and transformed deep losses into something that looks like hope and something that looks like renewal. And so down here, I stuck in the definition of mourning because I thought that was pretty interesting. The difference between grief and mourning. Grief is the interior experience, if you will, and mourning is the outward experience. Mourning is an embodied experience. And so if you want to use ritual to be able to move through grief, then one of the things that you can do is a little bit of Googling on other cultures and how they have grief rituals. And maybe you can find something that can be deeply meaningful for you. Or look to your communities that already have grief rituals, because they can be so powerful. And if you want to read more about grief, this book by Frances Weller, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, is an amazing book. Another thing that you can do to be able to move yourself through grief and to be able to comfort yourself along the way is to create a phrase, a soothing phrase. And so here, it doesn't matter how you relate to this inner language. It could be a prayer, a mantra. I call it a soothing phrase that doesn't have much, there's not much stigma associated with soothing phrase. So it works for most people. But one of the things that you want to do when you're creating this phrase is that you want to check in with your body and you want to see how your body is responding to this inner language. And there's no wrong inner phrase to be able to use with grief to soothe yourself in the moment. But you want to watch out for resistance. You want to watch out for when your body is like, I don't believe that, or it tenses up. What you really want to feel is if the feeling sounds like this. Okay, good. That's when you know you've got a good soothing phrase for yourself. All right. And the final thing, 4 minutes. Excellent. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is actually one of the most powerful meditations or practices that I have ever encountered in my life. And it's certainly the most powerful one inside the curriculum of mindful self-compassion. And that is this processing difficult emotions. And so the way this is done, and you can play along with me if you'd like. When I work with people, oftentimes I have them close their eyes for this type of a process, but you don't have to do that today. But it's helpful to bring people out of their normal busy brains and to bring them into more of a state of calm when you do this process. And so the first thing that you can do is have them remember a time that they had experienced a loss. And now some people might be in the middle of it, so it's not that hard. And allow them to see if they can identify some of the emotions that are coming along with that loss. And in this process, you want to give yourself a lot of permission. Like there's no wrong answer, allowing whatever shows up to show up. And then once you have a set of emotions, it's helpful if you can focus in on maybe the strongest emotion at the time, like the emotion of grief that's giving you the heart. Maybe it's hopelessness. Maybe it's anger. Whatever that emotion is. And then see if you can close your eyes and find it in your body. Now, I remember when I came out of recovery and somebody told me to find an emotion in my body. Number one, I couldn't even name an emotion. I needed a motion wheel to look at. And so if that's where you are or your clients are, 100% permission to use the emotion wheel or any other construct of emotions. And then this whole idea of being able to put it in my body was so foreign. And so it can be helpful to give people permission to just put it in there if they can't feel it for themselves. But other people might be able to feel it. It might be associated with like a tension in your chest or maybe a pain in your elbow or something like that. And once you've found that emotion in your body, or you've placed that in your emotion in your body on purpose because you want to work with it, that's when you can begin to shift it. You can begin to kind of play with it. So often, emotions like grief feel overwhelming. That feels like it's never going to go away. Feels like it's static and it's there forever. But in fact, our emotions are waxing and waning and moving all the time. And this process of softening, soothing, and allowing helps you to understand that in an embodied way. So by softening the emotion, you might just be visualizing the emotion in your body, maybe as a color or as a shape, and you might just soften the edges, or maybe it becomes a little more transparent, or maybe it's a little bit smaller. Whatever is working, there's no dictate of how this needs to happen. And then the soothing is literally envisioning sending some love to it. I like to use my hands as a way to put it over the part in my body that's experiencing the emotion. And I might even just pet it. This is using the C fibers that go directly to our amygdala to calm ourselves. This is science. This is not just Cynthia petting herself. And soothing. And then the final step is probably one of the most important things that you can understand about grief is that if you can allow it to be just as it is without having to change it, you can release that resistance. So often that's the permission we need just to just to release a little, just to relax, allowing ourselves to be okay, allowing ourselves to be sad, to be mad. All right. Oh, there we go. And happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Phelps. That was wonderful. And I must say, your voice for presentations, especially something like this, really helps transfer the message and what you're trying to convey to us. So yes, kudos. Thank you. I'd like to open the floor for questions and comments for Dr. Phelps.
I'll peek at the chat too if you want to just throw it in there.
Well, I will jump out there real quick and just say thank you so much, Cynthia. We really appreciate it. Going into this season, and I think there are many of us that do have grief and some other things that throughout the year that we're having to deal with in these seasons, whether it be Thanksgiving, Christmas, or however people celebrate this time, tends to bring up a lot of you're talking about the hand in front of your face kind of, right? So I think that was a great demonstration of that, and so especially great timing as well. Thank you.
I agree. Yes, we're kind of forced to face some of the family losses around this time of year. Yeah, excellent point.
I was really intrigued. Thank you for a wonderful, really meaningful presentation. I was intrigued by the idea of collective grief because so many of our communities, especially I guess since COVID, have just kind of had this piling on of difficulties and tragedies. And I live in a small community in Vermont that has had a lot of tragedy and loss and complexity. And it's hard to know how to translate some of what works for us individually to a larger scope. So I don't know, any resources about that would be appreciated, I guess, or a few comments.
Absolutely. And so I would take it back to ritual. And so let me give you a quick example. I was dislocated for 4 weeks, and then I came back into my community and I saw all the devastation. And here we're in an old growth forest, which is not super common in the US. And so we lost so many trees. It was really heartbreaking. And I was just a mess because I would be driving and everything would be fine. And I'd turn a corner and then just trees and rubble and destruction laid out, right? And one of my communities put together a requiem for the trees, like a funeral for the trees. And we got together and we sang and we shared stories about trees we love. We talked about our trauma in losing and in loss and that was it. And I emerged from that experience like amazingly different person. It restored hope and, you know, acknowledging your grief, it's kind of like group support, right? Where you realize that some of the symptoms you're experiencing are not because you're weak or, having a hard time as an individual, as our culture will have us believe, but it's because you're part of experiencing this collective grief. So I would say create your own ritual. I mean, that would be amazing. Okay, I think I
Thank you,
see a
Dr. Phelps. I
question.
see a hand raised. Zelma, if you'd like to unmute and ask your question before we move on.
Yes, quickly. I just wondered when Christmas seems so structured with children, and we know that children grieve differently. Did you have any way or any idea about building in during family activities and all times? There's a lot of upset at animals, like you said, with these natural disasters and with just the world in general. I was just wondering, children grieve differently at Christmas. They're always supposed to be happy about Santa and everything's so high expectation. But when you have a death in a family or a situation, we see the children sort of taking quiet times or not participating, 2 or 3. So, what would you tell a small congregation to build in for maybe something for children?
Well, first of all, I would definitely say that the thing that you can do is to talk about the loss. Be that adult who's not afraid to talk about the loss, because a lot of people are afraid to bring it up. It's just still stigmatized so much in our culture. So that's number one. Just like be normal about like, man, it's a bummer grandma's not here this year. Like and be real about the whole thing. And give them something that they can do. Give that kid a embodied thing to do. Can they um can they draw a picture, or can you allow them to light a candle, or to do something, right? That signifies, that represents, it's a remembrance, right? And so those types of honorings can be so transformational for us, and especially kids, and put it down on their level, right? Something that's really special and I don't dare say fun, but you know what I mean.
Thank you, Zelma, for your question, and Dr. Phelps for your wonderful answer. And thank you all for your participation. Thank you, Cato. We'll now move on to announcements. So first, to claim your CEU credit, you must complete the post-session survey in the chat or by the email sent after the session. Complete the post-session survey and select yes on the question, are you applying for CEU credit for today's ECHO session? Your certificate of completion will be sent to you 2 to 3 weeks after today. And if you have any questions, please email bwelltexas@utesca.edu. Next slide, please. Thank you. December's Recovery Support Services ECHO has been canceled due to the holidays. We do hope you enjoy your time with loved ones. Please join us for our next session scheduled on Wednesday, January 22nd. Next slide, thank you. And exciting news, our Recovery Support Services ECHO will be transitioning to a new and improved platform, iECHO. This online system will serve as a one-stop shop for all ECHO participants, providing an enhanced user experience. So to access it, participants will need to create an iECHO account. But right now I'll hand it over to Jasmine Vidal, who will guide us through a live demo of the new iECHO platform.
Hey, hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Angela. My name is Jasmine Vidal, and I'm the ECHO coordinator. So as she mentioned, we won't have a session in December. And then our next session will be in the iECHO platform. So I'm going to do a quick demo on how the ECHO platform will look once you have created an account. So here, once you log in into your account, this is how your dashboard will look like. This will be your home page. On the left-hand side corner, you'll have ECHO stories, ECHO updates. On the middle section, you'll have a search bar where you can search for programs with program names using keywords. And then once you have added programs, into your profile, they will come out in this middle section. As you can see here, these are some example programs. And then on the right-hand side, you'll have your profile completion, any new announcements, your journey, how many programs you've enrolled in, sessions you have attended, and certificates that you've received. So everything will be on this new platform. Once we have our program, we'll go ahead and send you an email with the program link. That way you can register for our program. And it'll come out similar to our TextRx Echo. It'll say the program name, and it'll be by the University of Texas Health Science Center, San Antonio. And then you will have an orange notification that says, to participate in this program, we need some additional information from you. This will be the registration form. We ask that you register for a program before the session. You will not be able to attend the session unless you register for the program. Okay, and then to view program details, you will click on the name. And this is an example. We already have our TextRx Echo on the iEcho platform. So we'll say the name, program description, who this Echo is for, program details will be in this page. And then to view the sessions, you will click View Details. And then you'll have your schedule. This is where you will be able to see the sessions. It'll have the date, the name of the session, the time. And then you can also see content. So we will be, instead of emailing you the PDF, how we do in the post-session email, you can see it in the session information or in the content app, in the content tab. All session information PDFs will be uploaded into this session. So in case you missed a session and you want to review the didactics, you can do so by going into the program and looking at the content tab. And then the final tab is a discussion. This is where we will share any announcements, program information, program details, or session updates. So this is a quick overview of the iEcho platform. We look forward to seeing you in January. Please be on the lookout. In the post-session email, I will send out information on how to create an account. And then we will send the program link so you can register for our program. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jasmine. So before we move on to our case presentation for today, I would like to remind everyone that no protected health information is allowed in either the chat or our discussion, and let us continue making this space inclusive and open to respectful dialogue. So with that, Belinda, there we go, Cato shares the case. Please walk us through it.
So my client has a CPS case and is part of FRC court. And after her inpatient treatment, she went into sober living, attended all of her meetings, her CPS meetings, CASA, foster parenting. She's working as a paralegal from her home, and she recently also took her mental health peer support training. She's always stayed engaged with me and always shown up and gone above and beyond. She is now living in a residential program and has returned to monitor again this October, and she plans to continue her paralegal at home during this return to monitor. My client is currently sober and in control of her substance use disorder, no relapse since before she actually went into treatment. She's been evaluated by psychologists, and she is no longer depressed and seems to cope well with life stressors. She's physically healthy and feels good about herself. She's very confident, outgoing. She's very active in the community and loves to help her peers get to their meetings and court appointments, and even meeting up with them at the park with their children. She's very comfortable working with our FRC team and other professionals, and her goal is to get full-time work as a mental health peer specialist, once she has full return of the children and they get used to their new schedule. Obstacles that I witnessed during her 333 days as sobriety is her husband, who is the father of the child. He continues to fight the system and is in denial about his own substance use disorder. And this at times has her very upset. She gets FaceTime visits with him each morning on their way to school, and also in couples counseling. The team is concerned that she's not herself when in the room with her husband, and caseworker stated she isn't talking much in couples counseling like she does when she's usually alone. My clients always lean toward reuniting with her husband once that is allowed and living happily ever after. After observing him in court last week, the whole team feels like the relationship could definitely cause a return to use for her. So my questions are, how do I gently bring up with her that how we are seeing this as very unhealthy without telling her the whole team sees this or is thinking it? Do you want me to read all three questions or just one?
Yes, please. And then we'll open the floor for
Okay.
discussion. Thank you.
And my second one is, how can the client be guided to recognize and acknowledge risky behaviors, both her own and her husband's, that could negatively impact family reunification court, while addressing her resistance to self-honesty and her steadfast belief that all is well despite being in early recovery? And initially, client was prescribed Depakote. Approximately 4 months ago, client chose to discontinue taking her medication despite therapist recommendation and prescribing physician. And from a peer perspective standpoint, client autonomy and self-determination is very important. But again, the team believes this is yet another example of risky behavior that could cause return to use. So what recommendations does anyone have for me?
Thank you so much, Belinda. At this time, I'd like to open the floor up for discussions. For discussion and questions? Do we have any questions from our team or Learning Network for Belinda regarding the case?
I have a couple, if you wouldn't mind. Would you describe what a return to monitor is?
So the children have been returned to her, but they are monitoring it.
Oh, okay, thank
She
you.
just hasn't had complete reunification yet.
Okay, so there's more than one child, because that was one question I had too.
Yeah, there's two. There's one's 18 months and one's 3.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
And is there a wellness plan or a reunification timeline? I was thinking of transitions are always tough, right? And if she's going back from a residential setting to back home, cohabitating with her family, that's a big change. And is there a timeline of preparing for that change during which the risks could be discussed?
Well, she has like a case manager with CPS, and she has CASA, and then she has her parent coach. So they all discuss these. She meets with each one weekly, and then she comes to court once a week, and then they staff it and they discuss her. I don't go into staffing because specialty courts weren't designed for peer specialists to be in the staffing to hear all the sanctions. So that way I'm kind of left out of it. I used to go in there, and then we talked about how it really was designed that I wasn't in there, and I really like it better because I don't hear all of that. So I can stay on the other side of it. So when they do the return to monitor, it depends on how long that lasts, but I do believe that they did talk about sometime in December, if everything goes well. She does have a home already somewhere that she could move back into. But the dad, he just has only been in the system, actually part of the team for about 3 months. whereas she's been of around 9 months.
Thank you.
And it just has a lot of resistance.
I'm looking at what's in the chat here. Let's see. Are there other questions or comments from the group? Ideas you've had from your own experiences? Oh, are they receiving any co-parenting coaching?
Yes. They've had that, and now they're in couples counseling, and that's one of the things is the counselor said he's observed her in other situations, but when they're in the couples counseling that he does most of the talking and she kind of just shuts down and don't talk. So in last week was actually the first time they've ever been in court together where she observed him. So yesterday I asked her how she felt about a couple things that judge had said to him. And she said, well, I was like blown away hearing him, the husband, the way he was, because she said it was like totally opposite of what he is in other counseling sessions or with her. And I said, so which one is him? The one that was in the courtroom or the one? And she said, you know what? I've got to think about it. So gave her something to think about.
Not to put you on the spot, Kenneth Rhymes, but I see your hand raised. If you'd like to yes, go ahead. Oh, it looks like we can't hear you. If you'd like, you can also drop your question in the chat or comment in the chat. Richard, I did see you were unmuted.
Oh, I was just because it's quiet in here, so I thought I would. But I am curious though, what the family reunification court, it's like, what does that look like? Are there time frames? Are there specifics that have to be met along the way? What does that look like?
Yeah, well, they have pretty much like specialty courts, like drug court. They have 4 phases. And, in the first phase, they have to get their sponsor. They have to make the meetings. They have to come to court. They go and get their mental evaluations. They may have to go, if they've had a previous positive, they may have to go get hair follicles. They have to be in sober living homes, get a job so they can pay their bills. And each step is it's just planning for the next phase to get to where they need to be.
And does the reunification court, do they support you as their coach in being able to, continue that relationship and develop that so that when she moves from one atmosphere environment into another, you would be there to support her in that?
Oh yeah, they actually call me all the time, the judge and the case manager, when they come into treatment or they just have someone that it's not even coming into treatment. They requested like 2 years ago, we can Belinda be all of our people's coach. So they really love that. They love the peer support. Actually, they wanted to hire full time next year, but I said no.
I do want to highlight Kenneth Ryan's question did come through. Are there any support groups for women she can possibly attend?
Yeah, there's a lot of different ones. I actually had given her what's the name of that? I don't know if you've ever heard of the book called Attached. And there's a worksheet on there where you can do the worksheet. It says which attachment you are, which type of relationship attachment you are, either secure, avoidance, or anxious. So she was excited to do that last night. And then you can do it and see how your partner is. She does go to women's groups, and where she's at, they have women's group in the her counselor and her case manager, this all just kind of popped up about a week ago for me, because that's the first time I had seen her husband's in the court too, but I had to assign him to another coach because I couldn't coach them both. So I've never had any dealings with him. And all I've ever heard her is just talk great about him. And when we were in court, I was like, and judge told him, you stop, everything I say to you, just keep deflecting. And he's very argumentative and not getting nothing out of this program. Y'all just going to take my baby anyway and stuff like that. So it was just like a red flag for me. And I was like, is he like this all the time, or was it he just having a bad day?
I
Yeah.
know that reunification is the goal, but when will she first be living on her own for a period of time before the whole family is,
Most likely she will be.
that's some more of that transition time that can help her prepare potentially. And
They've
she'll have
actually
an
been together
ongoing,
for 3 years.
sorry.
And I was gonna say, they've actually been together for 3 years.
Okay.
I'd love to hear anyone else's thoughts.
Here's a hand from Vermilia.
Yes, I was listening to what you were saying, Susie, about, and somebody else mentioned the reunification piece. It doesn't sound like they've been together very, very long. And I was just wondering if there are any strong dad support groups or men support groups that perhaps dad could be referred to.
Oh, yeah, he's actually in counseling and in group therapy outside of their couples therapy. And that's why I said, they say he does great. All the reports are good. He does really great in all these other groups.
Are those parenting groups, or just I mean, not just, but
I'm not
something's missing. I mean, there's a gap. It sounds like there's a real gap there.
Well, I believe that he had. So he's kind of new in the court. So probably he's getting through a few of the initial things that they have him work on, and then they're going to staff and have him go for. They've been trying to get him go for his psychological evaluation, but he keeps putting that off. But he will get it sometime. And then that's the next thing they're going to do is have his counselor be able to come and be a part of our family court, because the females counselors is part of our court, so maybe he can kind of advocate for the husband and maybe explain better what he's trying to say in the way he's saying it.
I know
I just asked that because I've had a lot of I do some of the parenting coaching and anger management, and oftentimes I get gentlemen that'll refer for anger management, and a lot of what they're experiencing is the grief piece we just talked about, and so that looks different in a different context, and sometimes it's really not picked up on. So that's why I was asking, kind of delving into that a little bit more. I may have tried to pluck it apart too much. Sorry.
Yeah.
No, don't be sorry. And thank you all for this wonderful conversation, for your questions, your insights, and the conversation in the chat. However, in the interest of time, I do want to give our lead expert, Susie, the floor to kind of give us a summary of the case and specifically the recommendations.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Belinda, for sharing this case with us. It sounds like overall, in spite of some challenges, this client has been doing, has a lot of really positive momentum, right? Is doing all the right things with the Family Reunification Court and CPS, and is continuing to work on her paralegal, and she seems to have a real strong motivation to work through all of this. And with the challenge of the reunification, she can build on her momentum working with the various counseling and peer support she has in place, to focus on those transitions that can be very tricky, to have a wellness plan, and to be thinking of her husband, or have him be thinking of his needs with his counselor and any dad's groups or Al-Anon or supports like that. Yeah, she's got a lot going on that's very healthy, and she has really good connections and some time before the reunification happens to explore those ways to protect herself in a new, or where she's cohabitating with a family and not living in a residential situation again. So it sounds like there's an awful lot of really good recovery capital there to work on, and a sincere desire for her own recovery and for reuniting the family.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Susie. Thank you to Dr. Phelps, Belinda, both of you for presenting today. Thank you to everyone that's attended the session. We look forward to seeing you all at our next session in the new year on January 22nd. Have a wonderful rest of your day and week. Bye-bye, everyone.